good afternoon, and welcome everyone to our webinar series. As you know, we are on the biochar topic, and today we bring to you smart biochar and biochar as the carry for nutrients and microbes. Just a little background on biochar. We know that biochar porous structure doesn't just amend soil, it also acts as a carrier for essential nutrients and beneficial microorganisms, and it can also reduce leaching. But very important, it creates a protected habitat that enhance microbial activity and nutrient cycle, which are, of course, very important factors for healthier soils. Maybe you know me. My name is Claudia Costa. I'm the director of Food for Sustainability Academy that is very pleased, along with the team, Soraya, Sofia, and Dimitra, to bring you these webinars. And at Food for Sustainability, let me remind you that our Soil Health and Function Laboratory studies how inputs like the smart biochar interact with soil biology. Specifically, we look at how functionalization creates these target nutrient carriers. And we have explored how the right biochar aligned with the right microbes can increase nutrient retention between a range of 25 to 40% while boosting key soil functions such as nitrogen cycling and phosphorus solubilization. So this is what we can do for biochar at our soil health and function laboratory. And at Ampliaqua, we test these principles in a multi-trophic aquaponic system while at projects such as the Idainha Rural Food Park, we scale these techniques across regenerative landscapes. And if a short reminder, if the sessions that we are holding here today actually sparkle your curiosity about what really is happening in your soils, I would like to invite you to take the next step and the next step with our theoretical practical soil microbiome analysis course. And over a few focus and dedicated sessions, we move from the concept to hands-on practice, and you will learn to plan your sampling, to understand sequencing and also functional indicators. Very important to interpret real microbiome reports and translate these reports into concrete management decisions, particularly around fertilization, organic amendments, and bio inputs. So this is a program that is designed for agronomists, technical advisors, but also innovative farmers, those that want to use microbiome data as a practical decision support tool and just really go beyond this nice to have reports. So if you think that this is the kind of competencies that you are missing, we have designed this course. So just take a look, dig a little bit more about what we have here. And we are just kicking off on the 9th of March. We would be very, very pleased to have you on board of the sessions. Okay, but now back to our session today. Let me very briefly introduce you three world-class experts that have joined our session today. Let me start to introduce you Valeria Araico. Valeria, she's a senior manager of operations and programs at the International Biochar Initiative. And Valeria brings over 10 years of experience building biochar partnerships and standards globally. Thank you so much, Valeria, for your presence. We also have the pleasure to have Paloma Campos. Paloma, she's a postdoctoral research at IRNAS-CSIC, and she's also a former University of Seville lecturer, and she specialized in environmental chemistry and biochar from agricultural waste for soil remediation. Paloma, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. And last but not least, Simon Jeffery. Simon is a professor of soil ecology at the Harper Adams University, and Simon's research shows how soil microbes drive sustainable agriculture through ecosystem processes. It's really a pleasure also to have you here, Simon. Thank you for your presence. And as we move along, let me just take one moment to remind you some of the house rules. Questions are definitely welcome. We're going to use Slido or the chat here in Teams for your questions. The team and myself, I'm going to pay a lot of attention to your questions, and we're going to direct them at the end of each presentation to each speaker. Also, we welcome to see your faces, but let me just remind you that this webinar is recorded. So cameras off if you don't wish to appear, but it's much more nice and friendly to see you and to have you with us and see your faces. Also, by the end of the session, we will again share with you a short quiz. This is important if you are looking for a certificate. We can issue a certificate as long as you fill in this quiz. If you're not looking for a certificate, I also invite you to fill in this quiz because it's fun to see what our speakers have, what are the main topics, and at least it will be a good roundup for what we have discussed here. So I think the house rules are settled. So what we have now, it's our warm up through Slido. Let's get familiar with Slido, and we have prepared, the team has prepared a couple of questions for us. You remember how Slido works, right? QR code for those that are more familiar with your phone, and QR codes for those that wish to use the computer. You need to type www.slido.com, and in the hashtag box, there's the password F4S Academy, and you should be able to access the questions. Right, are we ready to go? Let's see what we have here for us today. So, the first question is, what is biochar primary source? So, what is the primary source of biochar? Is it human waste, volcanic rock, heated plant material, animal bones? Sophia, we're not seeing the voting, so probably you need to change something at your settings, right, Sophia? So we are on it. Thank you. Now we can vote. Fantastic. So a little bit of explanation while you keep voting. So as we know, biochar is a carbon-rich solid that is produced by a thermochemical conversion of biomass in an oxygen-limited environment, a process that you should know by now because we addressed this last session. It's known as the pyrolysis. The feedstock is mainly ligocellulosic biomass, such as wood chips, crop residues, manure, or green waste. And it's through these controlled temperatures, which typically range, and we also addressed this in the past session, between 400 to 700 degrees, the volatile compounds are driven off, leaving a stable carbon matrix. So, and this is what makes it different from charcoal. And its main application is, of course, as a soil amendment. So, the primary source of biochar is actually a heated plant material. Well done. 90% answers right. Fantastic. Yes, you all deserve a round of applause. Well done. So next question. Biochar is famous for lock which elements in the soils? And we know that they can lock certain elements for centuries, if not more than that. So oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon. So what is the most famous element that biochar works along with? Okay, still voting. So biochar's chemical structure is dominated by carbon rings forming they are formed during pyrolysis. And this polycondensate structure is highly resistant to microbial and chemical decomposition, particularly when compared to the original biomass. And when this is incorporated in the soil, this recalcitrant carbon can persist, as we've heard before, between centuries to millenniums, a process that we know is called carbon sequestration. And this makes biochar a key tool for removing atmospheric CO2 and also for storing in very stable forms in the soil the carbon and as such contributing to climate change mitigation. So congratulations to all. A big round of applause because the most famous element is indeed carbon. Well done, everyone. Thanks also for taking part. And we have one final question. In a soil sandwich, I would like to see a soil sandwich. This is really cool. So, in a soil sandwich, biochar behaves most as a sponge for water and nutrients, plant roots, myceliums, or seeds. So it's a sponge for what main elements. And we know while you vote and while you think, we know biochar possesses a very defined porous structures with a vast internal surface area. And it is this porosity that gives it a high cation exchange capacity and also physical absorption places. So it works like a sponge. It can retain water within its pores, improving, of course, the soil water holding capacity. But at the same time, it also absorbs nutrient ions such as ammonia, potassium, and phosphate, and also organic molecules, preventing them from leaching and at the same time, it allows them a slow release to plant roots. So it's this dual function that enhances, the soil's resource retention efficiency. So you were absolutely right. Congratulations. Round of applause to all of you. Water and nutrients are the main elements that biochar acts upon. And because you're very knowledgeable about biochar, I'm really, really, I know that you're really, really curious to know a little bit more. We have wonderful speakers with us today. So I'll start to call Valeria to the stage. Valeria, hello. Whenever you're ready. The floor is yours. I can see Valeria now in the screen. You just have your microphone closed, Valeria. So
Yeah,
ready whenever you are.
perfect. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. Let me start with a quick clarification. I'm not a researcher or agronomist. I work as a project developer and implementer. So today I want to take a step back from experimental detail and look at biochar as a carrier for nutrients and microbes from a sector level perspective. This perspective does not replace research, it depends on it. Everything I'm talking about starts with research generated evidence. So instead of asking, does it work? I want to focus when it works, under what conditions, and why alignment matters as these applications move from research into practice. And this transition is exactly where research becomes most influential and also most vulnerable to misinterpretation. Um, yeah, so I was saying as to misinterpretation. And when I say alignment, I'm not talking about aligning practices or outcomes. I'm talking about aligning language, expectations, and how we communicate uncertainty at the sector level, because that alignment is often what determines whether advances actually translate into impact. And very briefly, why this topic is gaining attention. We're seeing growing interest in enriched and inoculated biochars for several reasons. In agriculture, for example, there's real pressure right now pressure to reduce fertilizer losses, pressure to improve efficiency, and pressure to demonstrate better soil outcomes with fewer inputs. And at the same time, there is renewed attention to soil biology, the microbes, nutrient cycling, and biological interactions. And that's where biochar begins to sound very attractive as a potential carrier. And then, of course, we're also seeing an expansion of commercial language terms like smart biochar, inoculated biochar, activated biochar. So as this space grows, clarity becomes increasingly important because we need to distinguish between structural potential, what biochar could do, and proven repeatable performance in real systems. And why is biochar considered a potential carrier? Well, biochar sounds promising because structurally it makes sense. Biochar typically has high surface, meaning a lot of internal surface created by pores, where nutrients and microbes can interact with the material. It also has porosity, which can provide habitat for microbes, stability, so it stays in the soil long enough to matter, and pore-water interactions that can influence moisture dynamics. And all of this suggests potential and explain why researchers explore biochar as carrier for nutrients and microbes. But again, having structural potential does not automatically lead to the same functional outcome and performance everywhere. Structure is not performance. Outcomes are always context. So a very quickly research snapshot. Across field and laboratory studies, researchers report changes in microbial abundance, shifts in community composition, and in some cases, effects on nutrient cycling. And this is consistent with how these systems are generally understood to behave. Pore structures that may provide the habitat, moisture retention that may support microbial persistence, and surface interactions can influence microbial dynamics. However, and this is key, responses are system dependent. Outcomes vary widely across soils, climate, management practices, and biochar characteristics. There is no universal response. So when you look across studies, you see a lot of variability. Sometimes effects are positive, sometimes they are neutral, and sometimes they can even go the other way. And even when you see benefits, they don't always show up in the same way. And this variability is not failure of research. It's an accurate reflection of complex living systems. So from a research perspective, variability is not a problem, it's insight. It tells us when, why, and under what conditions effects emerge. But the challenge begins when these findings are translated into products, claims, and expectations. And that's often when strong research loses impact, not because the science is wrong, but because context is lost in translation. And this happens when that variability is flattened or generalized as findings move beyond the lab or field trial. So system dependence matters. And this is really the central point. Biochar does not act in isolation. The outcomes depend on feedstock type, pyrolysis conditions, particle size, soil texture and chemistry, and climate and management. So when material properties and soil context are aligned, responses can be positive. When they are not, results become inconsistent or unpredictable. And this variability is where confusion enters the sector. Often that confusion doesn't come from the research itself, but from how research findings are simplified or repackaged for broader use. And it is also where terms like smart biochar, inoculated biochar, or activated biochar begin to appear. And these terms often point to real ideas and concepts, but they are not always used consistently or transparently. For example, products may be labeled as inoculated biochar, but it's unclear what was added, when it was added, and how long microbes are expected to survive. So the idea may be valid, but the way it's communicated can create confusion. And from an industrial perspective, this matters because once products leave the pilot stages, They enter supply chains, contracts, and performance expectations. And when variability isn't clear communicated, it becomes risk, operational risk, reputation risk, and sometimes financial risk. And this is where technical variability becomes a sector level issue. So before talking about the alignment at a sector level, I want to pause on one important idea. Biochar does not replace soil biology. It does not do the work for microbes. What it really does is influence the conditions in which biology operates. So I like to think it of this way. Biochar helps shape the stage, but it does not write the script. So whether microbes survive, multiply, or influence the nutrient cycling still depends on the material quality, the soil they're added to, and how the system is managed. And that's why two products that look similar on paper can behave very differently in real soils. And again, this is often where expectation starts to diverge from reality, because we want biochar to behave like a product with fixed outcomes, but soils are living systems, not controlled labs. So where does the sector needs alignment? As enriched and inoculated biochar products expand, a few recurring questions keep coming up. What do we actually mean by inoculated biochar? Which quality parameters are disclosed and which are not? And under what conditions were outcomes observed and validated? So the issue here is not innovation. The issue here is overgeneralization. Because when terminology is unclear, when quality parameters aren't transparent, and when field validation is weak or context-free, credibility starts to erode. And not just for one product, but for the entire sector. And again, this is why alignment matters in the clear language, in the transparent quality parameters, in the responsible communication of the claims, and on the ongoing dialogue between research and practice. This is where ongoing dialogue with researchers become essential, not to oversimplify results, but to preserve context as application scale. So we need to understand that coordination does not slow innovation. What it does is to strengthen credibility and trust as this application scale. From a user perspective, this raises very practical questions. If I'm a farmer or an agronomist, I don't just need a label that says smart or activated. I need to know what soil is this for, under what conditions was it tested, and what function is it realistically expected to perform. So it's not about adding more labels, it's about learning how to read them, understanding feedstock, intended application, and the conditions behind the claim. And that's a big shift from what does this product promise to what system was this designed for. And from a producer perspective, this is also challenging because as soon as claims enter the market, producers are expected to explain performance in very complex systems, often without shared definitions or common reference points. And again, that's not a technical problem, that's a sector coordination problem, and that's where confusion can scale very quickly. But we're also starting to see efforts to bring in more structure into this space through tools like the Biochar Atlas, regional standards, and emerging do no harm frameworks. And we need to understand that these efforts are not about simplifying complexity. They are about making it visible, so expectations and decisions are better grounded. I've heard cases where biochar was adopted with high expectations, but without a clear understanding of soil context or management conditions. And when the outcomes didn't match the expectations, the conclusion wasn't this application needs refinement. It was simply biochar doesn't work. And this is where IBI see its role. So IBI work across more than 70 countries, bringing together researchers, practitioners, producers, and policymakers. We do not prescribe agronomic outcomes, and we do not promote specific products. Our role is to help create clarity through shared language, supporting standards and quality frameworks, providing education, and facilitating dialogue between research and practice. So as nutrient and microbe-related applications expand, that connection becomes more important, not to provide simple answers, but to help the sector ask better, more grounded questions about where, when, and how these applications make sense. And this is why this matters for climate and sustainable agriculture, because if biochar is applied without preserving scientific context, it does not fail technically, it fails climatically, because the material may still exist, but the impact doesn't. So once we accept that outcomes depend on context, the question becomes, what does ready to scale actually look like? And this is why expectations, communications, and alignment matter so much as application scales. So for larger buyers or institutional users, the question is not, does it work? It's under what conditions does this make sense to deploy at scale? And that requires clarity, not stronger claims. So this year marks 20 years of IBI. Over these 20 years, working across regions, systems, and application, one lesson keeps coming back. Application mature responsibly when sectors coordinate early. So as interest grows in nutrient and microbial applications, coordination matters just as much as innovation. So if you're working at the intersection of biochar, nutrients, and microbial applications, we welcome dialogue, because if context is lost downstream, the science does not fail, but impact does. And that's not a failure of research, it's a signal that the conversation needs to continue beyond the lab. So research and researchers play a critical role in this, and not just by generating data, but by helping the sector understand when, why, and understand what conditions these solutions work, and by bridging the gap between experimentation and real world application. Because in the long run, credibility won't come from stronger claims. It will come from clearer language, better alignment, and shared understanding. Thank you so much.
Valeria, thank you so much for bringing a very important point and for nailing it down. It's indeed all these variables that we need to take into consideration if we want to expand the usage of biochar. There are still a lot of questions, and you have put it very clear that we need to pay attention to some of the points that you just mentioned. We have a couple of questions here. I will start with the questions from our participants. Valeria, see if you can address them. So one of the questions is about the bad microbial increase. So if you have pathogens in the soil, um, what happens? Do you see that the bad microbials increase alongside with the beneficial microbes? And can biochar make the situation worse, even in the case of contaminated soils, particularly those that have a lot of pathogens? Do you have any experience on this?
Yes, well, thank you so much for the question. I think it's a fair one, but I think that that's really not part of my expertise or my knowledge. But I'd be happy and glad to connect to the correct people that might be capable of answering these questions. And also, if you want to contact us through our info email, maybe there might be some resources in our website that we can share with you and might be able to answer this very specific question.
Okay. But this also goes back to what you were saying, that we need to test the soils and understand the context in terms of knowing the effects of biochar. And this also aligns with another question that we have here. It's asking about the legislation that regulates the production and the use of biochar. And in this sense, I would actually add, if we have IBI certification that helps also in this de-risking of biochar for farmers and farmer advisors. So do you have any certification that you are aware that actually says that it's safer to use and you can certify the way the biochar is produced, and or any more broad legislation that regulates biochar production. Can you address
Yes.
this?
Well, there are like different registrations, different registries that work with different certifications. IBI used to have their certification program, but it was merged with CSI. So CSI, it's Carbon Standards International. It's a registry based in Switzerland, and they are working with these different type of biochar certifications. They work with the European biochar certification, but also with the World Biochar certification, because they understand that not all biochar is produced in Europe, and not every biochar can comply with European guidelines. And also they have this artisanal CSIC certification as well. Not all biochar, again, is produced at an industrial scale. Sometimes it is in an artisanal way. So they have these registries. The standards that exist right now, I think that is two or three out there. But as I mentioned, there's like a lot of people, different organizations, and even different countries that they are working on their own standards. Actually, IBI is supporting one country right now in generating these standards, because the importance of having these clear guidelines to understand when biochar complies with all the metrics, all the guidelines, all the certifications, in order to work in a proper way. And also USBI, that is the United States Biochar Institute, if I'm not mistaken, in the acronym. They are working on these do no harm frameworks, so that people get to better understand what biochar needs to comply with, so that in the long run there's no more like damages instead of benefits.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't know
So
if that answers the question.
that's good legislation is coming out, so in order to protect also the adoption and the users of biochar. I think this is also important. We do have a lot of more technical questions. What we will do is we'll have them here in the chat also for Paloma and Simon. Maybe you will also want to have a look, because maybe some of them are on your field of expertise. But just one final question, Valeria. Are you aware if biochar that is produced in a more homely matter, more artisanal matter, if we can deliver the same climate benefits as the industrial pyrolysis produced biochar? Your microphone, Valeria, is muted.
So let me give me a second to break this. So yes, it depends, because, like I said, the context and everything. Artisanal biochar can deliver climate benefits, but those benefits depend on the feedstock, the production conditions, and how emissions are managed during production. So it depends on these factors. Um, but yes, from a climate perspective, artisanal and industrial biochar are not inherently better or worse. What matters is the system, again, how the biochar is produced, what emissions occur during production, and how it will be used.
Okay. Thank you so much, Valeria. This is very interesting topic. I hope you can join. I will ask, can stay with us a little bit longer. I will ask the team to place the questions for Valeria here in the chat, so that Valeria can access. And now let's move on to Simon Jeffery. Simon, hello. Good afternoon. You have been introduced, and I know that you're going to share a lot of knowledge, the bank of knowledge on biochar. I cannot see Simon.
Mm,
Is it?
I'm
Yes, Simon?
here. Hello.
Hello.
Maybe if I talk, it makes me appear. Hello, everybody.
Yeah, that's the trick. Thank you, Simon. Nice to see you. Simon,
Um,
whenever you're ready. Yes, we can see your presentation in presentation mode. The floor is now yours.
okay, yeah, great stuff. Yeah, thanks for the invitation to give this talk, and hello, everybody. I'm Professor Simon Jeffery. I'm based at Harper Adams University in the UK, and I've been doing research on biochar for a number of years. Yeah, dread to think, really, probably about 15 to 20 years. And I've been asked to talk on the topic that you can see in front of you, which is basically looking at nutrient and microbiome delivery, specifically using insights from meta-analysis. So before I move on to the presentation, just in case anyone in the audience isn't aware of what meta-analysis is, it's basically a process whereby you source the published literature, either peer-reviewed and sometimes what's called the grey literature, so professional publications, on a specific topic. So, for example, biochar impacts on crop yield. You find all of the papers that you can, you then check them for quality, but all of the ones that fulfill certain quality criteria, you extract the data from those, normally into an Excel database or something like that, run a load of statistics that you don't really need to worry about. I can talk you through how to interpret them without understanding the statistics, although I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any. And then you can interrogate the database in different ways. So it's an analysis of analyses. That's where the meta bit comes from. There has been a large influx of these in recent years, to say the least, on Google Scholar, if my computer advances. Oh, I don't know why it's working like this, but
Simon, do not worry about the participants coming in, okay? We will look after that, okay?
yep,
Just
no,
focus on your presentation.
yeah,
Thank you.
that's fine. I'm more concerned about not being able to advance my slides at the moment. My computer seems to have frozen. So just bear with me a second.
Simon, try to switch your camera off because we can see that, yeah, I think it will work best. Otherwise, Sophia will ask you to have Simon's presentation from your hand if needed.
Okay. Yeah, I had some issues with my computer. That's why I joined a bit late. But now, okay, yeah, spoilers. Okay, sorry about that. Right, here we go. So yes, going on Google Scholar and searching for biochar yield and meta-analysis, as you can see, there are more than 42,000 results that come up. So there's quite a few of these meta-analyses around. Now, admittedly, just using those terms, some of those will be talking about how much biochar you get from the pyrolysis process. But having looked through them, actually the vast majority of them are concerned with looking at crop yields in one form or another. Some of them will look at specific crops, some of them go on and look at yield scaled emissions and tie it in with climate change aspects. So that's in terms of all of the biochar yield meta-analyses. If we look at just what's come out this year, you can see there's already been more than 1,400. So there's a glut of these, shall we say. Now, meta-analyses are a very useful and powerful tool. As I say, you can pull together lots of disparate information, put it into a database, and try to answer questions from it. The downside of meta-analyses is you can't really prove anything just from statistics alone. So we really do need more empirical studies to understand some of the mechanisms so that we can really make evidence-based decisions about where the best biochar would be in the optimum situation, to align with what Valeria was saying in the previous presentation. Now, this glut of reviews and biochar reviews has led to a meme being circulated quite recently, which is this one, which I can't really laugh at too much as somebody who's contributed to all of these biochar reviews. So what do they say? This is a very recent one, looking at the yield response of 3 major staple crops to biochar, so looking at maize, wheat and rice. And if you look at the third line up from the bottom, you can see that we see on average about a 15% to 16% yield increase when biochar is applied to soil and a crop is grown when all else is equal. Now that result, somewhere around 12 to 16%, is fairly consistent in terms of crop yield meta-analyses. So I'm going to focus in on one that we published back in 2017, where we looked at a global scale meta-analyses. And the reason I'm focusing in on this one is because, well, I was involved in it, so I understand it better than all of the others. But I think it also provides some interesting insights into this nutrient question. And obviously this presentation is looking at nutrient delivery. So this is a forest plot, they're called. The way to interpret it is basically there's no y-axis. Everything is just separated out vertically. Each of the diamonds that you can see is the mean response. And so if you do an imaginary line from each diamond down to the x-axis at the bottom, you can see what the mean response is expected to be based on the category that's written on the right. The bars that you can see, the horizontal bars coming out of the diamonds, for the statistically minded, they are the 95% confidence intervals. If you're not statistically minded, that doesn't matter. The way to interpret them is basically if those bars don't intersect with the zero line, that's what we would call in science a statistically significant result. If they cross the zero line, as you can see they do, there's two of them down at the bottom under feedstock type temperate, which we'll get to in a bit, that's not a statistically significant result. There's basically a lot of variation and we're not confident that a result is taking place. So if we start at the top, we have the grand mean result. This is the average response of various different crop types when biochars are applied to different soil types. And we come out with an average response of somewhere between 12 and 13%, so not too different to what we just saw in the other presentation. Now, where things get interesting is if we look at soil pH. Where we see the biggest yield response is when biochar is applied to very acidic soils, soils with a pH of less than 5. As the soils get less and less acidic and more neutral, we see that the yield response actually decreases until we get to a stage where when we have a neutral to alkali pH, actually what we see is a statistically significant negative or basically no response. Now this provides some interesting insights. Now, firstly, in terms of nutrient provision, pH is a very key driver, as we will see in a minute, of macronutrient and micronutrient provision and availability in the soil. On top of that, while we see the largest effect on yield increases at less than 5%, it's not really a nutrient, but when you get very acidic soils, aluminium can actually become bioavailable, and that has a toxic effect on plants. Now, if you can raise the pH up to above about 5.5, and then you cross the aluminium toxicity threshold, that availability of the aluminium goes down, and basically it stops having a toxic effects on plants, and that has beneficial yield benefits as well. So if we move down and look at latitude, we see by far and away the largest effect on yield in tropical soils compared to temperate soils. Temperate soils we actually see is not a significant result, but is leaning towards being negative, and I'll get to that in just a minute. We see the strongest results in tropical soils. Now, tropical soils are clearly highly variable, but in general terms, a lot of tropical soils are free-draining, acidic, sandy soils, arenasols, those types of things, and ferrosols. So again, if you can apply biochar to those types of soils, biochar, as Valeria just mentioned, they can, under some situations, help retain water, which can help with resisting droughtiness. And due to changing the pH, as I've said, they can affect nutrient availability. Now, why we see the no significant result in temperate soils is in temperate soils, we're generally quite near our yield maximums anyway. We generally have intensive agriculture in temperate regions with high fertilization levels, and trying to add more nutrients on top of that from, for example, the ash fraction of biochar has very little effect. And in fact, if you raise the pH of a soil too much, you can put it beyond the optimum range for crop growth, and that's where we see these kind of negative responses. If we move down and look at dividing by feedstock type, now one of the things, and I very much agree with Valeria on this, one of the things that was difficult with biochar is language, and perhaps ironically, one of the most difficult things is the term biochar itself. When we say biochar, it gives the impression that there's just a single type of material that is biochar. But actually, it represents a very wide range of different types of materials with different characteristics. They're all carbon rich, admittedly, and they generally have a high pH, but some of them are highly porous with relatively low ash contents and relatively low nutrient contents. For example, a biochar made from wood. So we've defined those as structural biochars. They are something which, when you apply it to soils, you would perhaps expect it to form help hold onto water a lot better and form an environment for microbes. We also then have nutrient biochars. These are biochars produced from things such as manures or biosolids that, when they're applied to soils, they also contain labile nutrients and bioavailable nutrients that can be uptaken by crops. So by far and away, we see the largest yield effects when we see these nutrient-rich biochars applied to tropical soils, likely because they're providing nutrients and they're also having a liming effect and raising the soil pH. When we look at temperate soils at the very bottom one, we don't really see any significant effect, regardless of whether they're structural or nutrients. And again, in temperate regions, we generally don't have such issues around drought, although last year in the UK, we did actually have quite a large drought. And generally, our soils are quite fertile with high levels of fertilization. So I've alluded to this pH story. I suspect many of you are aware of this figure already, but if not, what we have up over here is that at the top of the figure, we have nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. These are the macronutrients. And as you can see from this circle, when we move from more acidic soils to less acidic soils, we increase the bioavailability of these nutrients. Conversely, if we go too alkali, if we raise the pH too much, it's micronutrients that become limiting. These generally decrease in terms of bioavailability. So in terms of the impacts of biochar on nutrients, as I say, it's twofold. Sometimes biochars can apply nutrients to soils, and sometimes they can change the pH and affect nutrient availability that way. Now, there are some empirical studies which show nutrients can come from biochar. In one study, we used stable isotopes, so we labeled some plants with 15N, and then we turned that into biochar and applied it to soils. And what you can see from the dotted lines is that nitrogen was bioavailable throughout all of the harvests of this perennial ryegrass in this experiment. So certainly some nitrogen can be made available. As you can see, it functions as a more slow release nitrogen fertilizer than the unpyrolized feedstock, which is what you can see in the darker lines there. Now, the ash itself, whether that's biochar or not, is a matter for discussion that still hasn't been resolved. If you are looking at a lump of biochar, it will contain an ash fraction inside of it. So when you're talking about biochar, you will necessarily be talking about the ash. But when you apply that biochar to soil, lots of the ash is actually relatively mobile, certainly more mobile and more labile compared to the carbon. So after a few years, you would expect the ash fraction to be gone, but the biochar to still remain in soils. Now, biochar in that ash fraction, it's been shown that can contain a lot of potassium, and that potassium is available for plant uptake. And that can be one of the main drivers for why legumes, for example, generally do quite well with biochar application. So moving on to the microbiome then, there's lots of talk about how biochar can be beneficial for the microbiome. The first study that I'm aware of that started to look at this was this study that came out by Edith Hammer et al. Back in 2014. And they showed that mycorrhizal fungi can grow on biochar surfaces and uptake phosphorus from the surface. So again, showing how these nutrients that are present within the biochar can be liberated. But things aren't so straightforward. As I say, biochar gives the impression that there's just this single compound, but actually there's a range of compounds. Another study that came out by Killam et al. Actually showed that microbial colonization of biochar that was left in the field was very sparse. They didn't really see that it became a significant habitat for microorganisms at all. So why do we see this disparity? Again, you can't answer those types of questions through meta-analysis alone. We need empirical studies. And one of the things that may provide some insights into that is looking at biochar impacts on soil hydrology. Now, biochar is generally considered to improve soil hydrology due to its highly porous nature. And you can see in these scanning electron micrographs some of those pores. They are pores which exist at the right sort of scale where they should hold onto water and keep it plant available. So there's lots of claims of it improving, particularly in sandy soils. But in an experiment I worked on back in the Netherlands, where we were working on a very sandy soil, there's about 90% sand, we actually didn't see any impact of biochar on soil water retention, all the way up to 50 tonnes per hectare of biochar application, which is a considerable dose. That's far beyond any type of international policy permits at the moment, and far beyond what anyone generally recommends. So why didn't we see any benefit? Well, the thing is, some biochars, despite being porous, as you can see in this image shows an X-ray tomographic image of biochar particles. We showed that the biochar was basically 90% pore space, and the vast majority of those pore space were connected to the surface, so water should have been able to infiltrate. But the biochar itself was hydrophobic, most likely due to the depositions of tannins and tars on the surface of the biochar during the pyrolysis process. So even though the biochar was porous, water couldn't get in there due to this hydrophobic nature. And because one of the main ways that microbes move around within the water system is in water films and the like, if water can't penetrate into the biochar itself, then it's very unlikely the microbes will get in there. Nevertheless, people have run meta-analyses to look at the impact of biochars on microbial communities. What they've generally shown is if you have low temperature biochars and you apply them to soils, you can increase the fungal to bacterial ratio. This is generally considered a good thing. The fungi to bacterial ratio is quite often used as an indicator of soil health. And if you have more fungi and to a higher fungal to bacterial ratio, that's generally considered a positive thing. As for why low temperature biochars generally drive this, well, low temperature biochars generally have more labile carbon in them, and fungi are quite good at breaking that type of material down. Now, in this study, they saw that residues of biochars to dryland soils can increase gram-positive bacteria compared to gram-negative. But actually, why that occurs and what the implications of that on it requires further study. We really don't have any insights. Gram-positive bacteria are generally more resistant in dryland environments, so the added water retention capabilities of the biochar seems unlikely to be explaining it. Nevertheless, they have produced forest plots, and this is another type of forest plot very similar to what I showed you earlier. The main takeaway from this is lots of the data when you start to look at the microbiome is highly variable, and that's shown by the fact that those error bars, those 95% confidence intervals, are very large. The vast majority of the results they see that you can see there, those error bars intersect with a zero line, and so there's no significant result. One of the things which deviates from that is at the top on the left under pyrolysis temperature. You can see that the low temperature biochar, and that's where we see the significant increase in fungal to bacteria ratio. But that's a pyrolysis temperature of less than or equal to 350 degrees Celsius. That is quite a low temperature biochar. So in conclusion, biochar application to soil can increase crop yields. It is actually very important that you choose the right biochar for the right environment. One thing I should have mentioned when I looked at that, showed you that image of the biochar earlier, the best way to interpret those results is they are the results that you would expect to see if you took a random biochar and applied it to a random soil. If we get to the stage where we can choose the optimum biochar for the optimum soil, so if you have a soil which is already neutral, make sure you're not applying a lot of biochar with a very high pH to it where you're going to cause an overliming effect. If we can start to get to that matching of biochar with the environment, that's where we will be able to maximize those benefits. The main drivers of crop yields are increased soil pH, provision of nutrients, and changes in the microbiome, for example, by knocking on and affecting legumes, as was shown with that potassium study. But yeah, not all biochars are equal, so this limits the potential extrapolation of observed results. And what we really need to do is move away from just biochar reviews, which are looking at descriptive experiments, and really get a mechanistic understanding of biochar impacts following soil application, because it's only by doing that that we'll be able to make robust predictions as to where biochar will likely have the strongest effects when it's applied to soils. And with that, I will thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Simon, for such a good and insightful presentation. I think we need some time to digest all the information that you brought to us here. Just one question, Simon, from the work that you have developing. One of the claims that we hear a lot about biochar is that biochar can be used as a quick fix, particularly for soils that are very degraded or that have faced very intensive agriculture, and it is actually a quick fix. So what we are is saying implicitly is that when you depart from a very low basis, it's always a good application, the biochar. Do you have any evidence on this?
Well, it depends on what you mean by degraded and how the soil is degraded. So with intensive agriculture, what normally happens is that soils become depleted in soil organic matter. Now, one of the key things about biochar, and again, this is still up for debate, I would argue that despite being an organic material, when biochar goes into the soil, it isn't soil organic matter. It's a separate material. And the reason why that's an important distinction is soil organic matter within the soil gets degraded by microbes, and then that basically feeds the soil food web. And if you have a degraded soil, basically what you normally have is not enough soil organic matter, which means you've not got a well-functioning soil food web. If you apply biochar to that soil, you might change some properties like water retention and change the pH, but you're not providing food for the soil biota, because the whole purpose of applying biochar to soils is it sticks around for a long time. The fact that it sticks around for a long time shows it doesn't decompose. So if your soils are degraded because they're too acidic, and so you've got lots of aluminium, and that's having a negative impact, adding biochar would have a quick fix. It would raise the pH, and that would help improve your crop yields quite quickly. But if your soils are degraded due to lack of soil organic matter, I would argue you need to build up your soil organic matter by having cover crops, applying compost, and applying these other materials, potentially alongside compost, but certainly not instead of doing biochar instead of those actions.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective also, because we see biochar also as providing the habitat for the microbes. But what you're pointing out to us is that you need to ensure that you have the right food for these microbes for them to thrive. And on that, Simon, may I ask you one of the question that was earlier on about the pathogens
Yeah.
and the beneficial microbes? Any insights of that? We need to be
So,
careful.
yeah, no, in general, not. Now, I couldn't possibly say that biochar application to soil never maintains or increases pathogen populations. I couldn't say it never happens. However, generally speaking, if you have a reasonably healthy soil, when you apply biochar to that soil, because you can increase the refugia, you can increase places where the microbial consortia can grow. You can basically increase the aeration of the soil because biochar generally has a relatively low bulk density. You can increase water retention. Generally, you increase beneficial microbes within the soil. Well, that's the general understanding. Now, if you have more beneficial microbes or neutral microbes, they will generally outcompete pathogens. Pathogens normally only have evolutionary advantages when they're inside the host. Outside of the host, they normally get outcompeted by other organisms. So you would normally expect biochar to reduce pathogen loads, if anything.
Okay, good answer. Simon, we have a question, especially for you. Simon, you mentioned that accumulated biochar doesn't allow water to enter the pores of the biochar. Okay, that's hydrophobic. Maybe lower pH helps dissolve that tar film, and that's why better yields were achieved in lower pH. Would you like to comment on this?
I haven't seen any data on that. Generally, with hydrophobic biochars, the tar layers are quite persistent. I don't think that the low pH of a soil over a short term would degrade the tannins. Generally, they're relatively labile, so I think it's more biological that will break down the hydrophobicity over time. I think what the best plan of action really is to ensure that your pyrolysis is done in such a way and your cooling is done in such a way that you manage to off vent all of your syngas and bio oil so that they don't recondense onto the biochar in the first place. And that way you can avoid your biochar becoming hydrophobic.
Okay.
So,
Thanks, Simon, for throwing in also those insights. And again, so water holding capacity from the soil is actually something that is drawing attention from our participants. How can we make sure that we have water holding capacity over the pyrolysis? Um, I mean, how can we avoid these tar layers?
yeah, as I say just now, the key thing is to make sure during the cooling process or before the cooling process takes place, you off vent your bio oils and your syngas as much as possible. Now, if you're using relatively old-fashioned kit, that's not always necessarily possible. In those situations, it has been suggested that if you can accelerate the cooling process, you can prevent some of that condensation happening. I'm not a pyrolysis expert, so what I would say is in modern systems, if you can off-vent as much of the materials as you can to keep it away from the biochar before it starts cooling, that seems to be the best way forwards.
Just one final question, Simon. Since you are on the market of biochar and you have investigated very thoroughly what the body of knowledge is showing us about biochar. Where do you think would be the 2 or 3 points for the industry as the standard to offer standards that would offer um, more certainty, so de-risking this adoption for farmers? Where do you think the industry should go? Because there are a lot of variables, there are a
Yes,
lot of
indeed.
things happening. What would, in your perspective, what should be the next direction?
So I think what we need to do is build up the evidence base and continue to do that through robust empirical studies. So a lot of the current certificates, they borrowed some numbers from, for example, composting studies and the like in terms of trying to develop specific characteristics that we need. So as an example, if you want to minimize the amount of nitrous oxide emissions following biochar application, or you want to maximize the N2O reduction potential of biochar, it's been shown that you need soils with a relatively high relatively low hydrogen to organic carbon ratio. Now, if you look at the European Biochar Certificate, they talk about a value of 0.7. And if you are making biochar from straw or crop residues, you will struggle very much to be able to achieve these kind of lower values. Now, that number was borrowed from compost and probably needs to be revisited based on empirical studies. And so a lot of these certificates were great, but we needed to make sure that there were specific standards so people weren't producing biochar that was laden with heavy metals and just applying it everywhere. But updating these in the light of new science is basically where we need to go.
Okay, thank you so much. Simon, we need to move on now. If I can, I also direct your attention to the chat. You have at least one more question for you. And I will now call Paloma. Hello, and Paloma will tell us a little bit more about the feedstocks and the research she has been conducting about trying and experimental with different feedstocks, actually, for biochar functionalization. Paloma, hello.
Hello. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you. It's just that you're not in my screen, but I believe you're there. If you want to start by sharing your screen.
Can't you see my screen?
I cannot see your screen. But
Because before it's worked.
There
We
you are
tried.
now. Let's try it again. Let's try it again. It's not coming.
It's not working. I had to reconnect the internet because I had some problems during the conference. So.
Okay, let's give it a try. If not, Paloma, don't worry. We have your presentation from our end. So everything failing, we will run it past from our end. I think we are having problems with Paloma. Let's just wait a few minutes to see if Paloma reconnects. So I think we can, Sophia, start the kind of letting our participants know that if you want, just start by having a look. Paloma, she's here at the final assessment. We already had some knowledge. Paloma. Hello? Not here? They'll give me a sign when Paloma is back. So if you want to just start looking at the questions from Simon, from Valeria, you're very welcome to do it, to do this. So you can have your link open, and then let's wait for Paloma. I can see Paloma is here. Paloma, keep your camera off. It's probably easier because we can feel that your internet it's unstable. And yes, your presentation is here. So
Can you see it now and can you hear me?
yes, we can hear you.
I'm
Can see your
sorry.
presentation. Don't worry, all is good from our end.
Okay, so I will start now. Sorry for all of these problems. So in this case, we will see some examples and case studies. But before starting, I must say that present agriculture faces significant challenges, particularly within the context of a continuously growing global population. So to meet these rising demands, there is a need to intensify the agriculture production, so we use common or traditional fertilizer. Also, residual biomass is produced in high amount. Here you can see in Andalusia, for example, where I work. So it's crucial to develop a smart fertilizer to avoid the use of the conventional one. And this could be the biochar-based fertilizer. All of you know what is biochar because we were talking about this all the afternoon. But I will center a bit that biochar properties can change depending on the feedstock and the production conditions. The use of biochar is new. Here you can see many articles every year published about biochar and the pyrolysis process. But when we talk about biochar and nutrient-rich or biochar fertilizer, the number of articles is lower. Biochar in this case is related to phosphorus, nitrogen, carbon, or soil microbiology. So we will start with the production of the biochar. In this study, we selected different feedstock and different pyrolysis conditions. All of this was prepared in a batch reactor. This is important, as I will tell later. We used olive pit, olive branches, and rice husk. We characterized them with 13 carbon nuclear magnetic resonance. We performed the thermal analysis and the scanning electron microscopy. And with all of the characterization results, we represented the coefficient variation between the biochar properties with three variables, with feedstock, time variability, and the temperature of the pyrolysis process. In this case, I would like to highlight that hydrophobicity, for example, was more dependent on the residence time of pyrolysis, whereas the water holding capacity or the ash content depended on feedstock and also on temperature of the pyrolysis process. Talking about the chemical composition, we can highlight that aryl or alkyl carbon was dependent on residence time, whereas the carbon and nitrogen contents depended most on the feedstock. In a summary of these three feedstock, the biochar produced from rice husk was the one with the higher water holding capacity and pH. So it could be used, for example, it's ideal for the recovery of acid soils or to increase water retention in soils. However, the olive pit biochar had higher carbon content, but not so high water retention capacity. So it could be used, for example, when we want to achieve a long-term carbon sequestration. Also, we need not only to optimize how we produce the biochar, but to ensure before applying to soil that it is safe. I mean, it's free of contaminants, talking about trace elements or the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So in this other study, biochars were produced from different feedstock and pyrolysis condition, and this is important, in different reactors, the traditional kiln, the batch reactor, and a rotatory or continuous reactor. And to assess the risk, the potential risk of this polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons content, we measure the total toxic equivalent concentration. Here you can see represented the TTEC, depending on the feedstock, temperatures, and reactors. So the biochar with highest concentration of PAH were produced in the batch system. So we recommend to avoid that when we don't have a separation system for all these phases in the pyrolysis. And the safest biochars were produced in the rotatory continuous reactor. Also, it's important the temperature of the pyrolysis process. We observe that in the batch reactor at 400 degrees, the biochar got the maximum values of these PAHs. However, in this case, the feedstock was not so significant. As you know, biochar has diverse applications. For example, the remediation of polluted soils or waters, or to increase carbon sequestration. But when we talk about the nutrients available for crops, they depend. They are not always available because they don't have in some cases. So we can produce the biochar-based fertilizer by improving these biochars. For example, prior to pyrolysis, there are two different treatments. For example, the direct treatment, in which different feedstock are mixed. So we try to produce a biochar with more nutrients. For example, you can use a phosphorus-rich feedstock like bone waste. Another one is the pretreatment, in which our nutrient-poor organic biomass is mixed with minerals or industries residues, or can be produced after the pyrolysis and improve it by impregnation, enrichment, or encapsulating, trying to make higher the concentration of nutrients, reducing the volatilization. And one example would be the study of One et al. In 2023. They produced different biochars by mixing, granulating, and absorbing using 3 types of bacillus, trying to solubilize the phosphorus. And let's see, for example, 3 case studies. In this one, biochar was used trying to reduce in growing media for horticulture the peat in this substrate, because peat extraction can accelerate climate change. So in all of these studies, biochar alone or biochar co-applied with compost were used, in which different plant species were studied for their germination rates and nutrient status. When we talked about biochar alone, we observed that in some cases, the biomass of this plant species was higher, for example, with kitchen biochar due to nitrogen content, or with the good biochars, and the water retention was increased. However, in some cases, it didn't go well. For example, germination was inhibited or delayed when high doses of biochar was used, sometimes because of the high salinity that those biochars had. And we observed a synergetic effect when we applied biochar and compost due to more availability of nutrients. We went through a small scale to field scale. In this case, field experiment, it was a super intensive olive crop under deficit irrigation. In South Spain, we have sometimes not so much rain, so we need to irrigate a lot. So we try to use biochar to increase water retention and reduce irrigation. In this case, we measure the effects of applying biochar alone, compost, and the mix of biochar and compost. In this case, the amendments reduce the resistance of the soil to the penetrability and increase the soil moisture, facilitating the soil management. Also, the olives where the amendment were used improved the leaf water potential compared to the control ones in this case. What is important is that we increase the productivity. It's true that when we use only biochar, although the olives weight was higher, it contained much water. And also we measured the dynamics of carbon in this olive orchard. We studied the soil respiration, in which the compost amendment soils respirated more, and also we studied the fraction, labile, and recalcitrant of carbon fraction with thermal analysis. And relating all of this and total carbon, we estimated mean residence time of this stable organic carbon in the soils, being the highest for the biochar amended plots. Another example could be this one, in which we studied how we change the properties of several agro-olive stock residues by composting, anaerobic digestion, and pyrolysis. So we didn't use biochar alone. We also composted biochar or mixed them with compost or the digestate and the compost leachate. In that case, after characterization, they were studied how germination of barley was modified. In this case, biochar produced from lignocellulosic materials didn't have effects on the phytotoxicity. Seeds couldn't germinate, and the water retention was also increased. However, when biochar was produced from other feedstock, for example, from wool waste, we observed high concentration of trace metals, and the germination was reduced. It was inhibited. So maybe it could be used as an organic herbicide, not for a fertilizer. And when we talk about the liquid residues, the digestate or the compost leachate, alone they had phytotoxic risk, but they had high amounts of nutrients. So we observed that co-applying the biochar with these liquid residues, we could neutralize the phytotoxicity and maintain the high nutrients delivery. In 15 minutes, I don't have time to put so many examples, but I recommend to read this review in which you can see many of the biochar-based fertilizer, how they are produced, and also how they are applied, and the benefits that we have. But we also have some challenges. Talking about the economic barriers, biochar is a low density amendment, so sometimes it's a bit costly for small farmers. So we recommend to use the local residues they have close to their region. Also, talking about the technical barriers, as it was mentioned before, biochar is a very heterogeneous amendment. It has variability depending on feedstock, pyrolysis reactor, and conditions. So we need to center in all the bibliography that we have, because many times it has been characterized. And talking about the regulatory barriers, we still have some gaps. However, we have the new soil monitoring law and soil deal for European Mission, in which soil health and food is one of the most important things in this case. So we can achieve an efficient system in which circular economy meets sustainable agriculture, in which we produce the food and all this waste is transformed to biochar-based fertilizer through pyrolysis, maintaining soils healthy. For the take-home messages, it requires a shift from the generic solution, as also my colleagues said before. It's very heterogeneous, so we need site-specific ones. We recommend to analyze the specific local needs to optimize the available resources and wastage that we have, and implement the science-backed carbon solution with all the meta-analysis and reviews that we have. Here you will have my email in case some question we don't have time to answer now. You can write me and ask me later. I would also thank to Food for Sustainability for letting me participate in this cycle of webinars. Thank you very much for your attention.
Paloma, we thank you for taking part in our webinars. Thank you so much. Let's start with a couple of questions while you are here, and then I'll just open to the floor to all the participants. So, Paloma, one question. So, do you know if the moisture in the wood has any effect on the polycycle aromatic hydrocarbon? Can you elucidate with us? And Paloma, sorry to interrupt. Can you just, because we are seeing ourselves on your screen, it's a bit confusing. So if you stop sharing and open your camera, it's probably more friendly to everyone. Thank you.
Sorry for that. Yeah. When we studied the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, we used the good without high humidity. I mean, we didn't change a lot the feedstock, but it was like in Seville in summer we have 40 degrees, so we didn't quit all the humidity, but it wasn't with high content, and we observed that not also the feedstock and the humidity, but the temperature of the process and the reactor was the most important thing.
Okay, thank you. So when we have another question, Claudia refers that to your presentation. At some point, you were saying about the need to add nutrients to the biochar, and the question is, why not use those materials direct and not first add them to the feedstock and then make the biochar. So you add the materials first to the feedstock and not to the biochar.
Mhm.
Why do you use them in that sequence?
This is why I said we can do it prior to pyrolysis or after pyrolysis, because if you select different feedstock that are rich in specific nutrients, and normally you use them because they are residues, so you have to revalorize them. So you get or three of them that are nutrient rich, so you produce the pyrolysis. However, if you want to add it before the pyrolysis, sometimes you still lose the nutrients, maybe due to volatilization. Maybe it doesn't remain in the solid part of the after pyrolysis. This is why you have to choose depending on what you want to achieve.
Okay, good, thank you. Olive pomace is also a dear topic to us here in Portugal. Biochar from olive pomace. Any more information? Is this being used in Andalusia? Can you tell us a little bit more if you know producers, industry that are using olive pomace for biochar?
Mhm. If I don't remember bad, I think there is one producer of biochar with olive pomace, but sometimes like you need to specify the condition on the reactor, because sometimes when you produce the biochar, it has high salinity, very, very high salinity after the pyrolysis. So, or you treat it, you wash it after the pyrolysis, because if not, you can get germination inhibited, for example. But we use it in Andalusia, but carefully. You can
Okay.
use it, but carefully.
Mm-hmm. So the standards need to be there. Paloma, one more question. Can you comment on the pyrolysis process conditions such as temperature, time, cooling time, use of the pyrolytic gas? Can you describe a little bit more the process and the conditions that this process happens?
Normally, I get more focus on the solid one, because normally I study the biochar. As Simon said also before, I'm not the pyrolytic person itself for the
Expert.
process. Yeah,
Mhm.
like I select the conditions, try to get the best biochar part. I also start working with the liquid one, with the acid, the pyroligneous acid as herbicide, for example, but I haven't worked with the gas part. So I
Mm.
don't know how to increase or like to get more in that gas part.
Okay. We wanted to know everything, but as the knowledge
It's
is
a
still.
wide topic.
Yes, it is. But we can see it's a very interesting topic. One final question, and I will close the questions. Paloma, again, your opinion. In Mediterranean soils, what would be the best type of biochar, if we can call it a Mediterranean soil?
Uh,
Let's see how you
it's
handle this one.
I think I don't have only one solution for this question. I mean, it depends on why do you want to use the biochar. Like as Simon said before, if you have a soil degraded for intensive agriculture, not only biochar. Or, for example, in Mediterranean, we have many acid soils. So if you produce, for example, from rice husk biochar, it has very, very, very high pH. You have to contrast, because if you're, in my case, when I have some field studies, my soil has 8.5 or 9 pH, and my biochar has 12 or 12.5 pH. So sometimes it's not so good in that case. You can modify the biochar or select other type of biochar from other feedstock, for example. But it depends on in Mediterranean soil for what. For example, I use a good biochar when I want to sequester carbon in my Mediterranean soil, but not because I want only productivity in crops.
Okay. It also depends not only on the soil type, but also on the goal and the problem that you are trying to address. I need to apologies to all our participants. It's great to see your questions. It's great to see them coming. I just want to two things before we leave. One is to invite you to fill in our very, very short quiz. I know that our speakers also deserve that you show that you paid attention to what they are saying. And while you scan here the QR code, I will also ask the team to paste here the link. As we can see, biochar is very, very important topic, and it's very we would like to know more. We would like to see more spread and more use of biochar. So I would like to hear from our experts that kindly join us today, and actually to wrap up our discussion on biochar potential in terms of soil health. From your perspective, if we need to take one practical step for farmers, researchers, certifiers, and we haven't addressed much, but industry players, what recommendations would you make, or which stakeholder would you select to ensure that in the coming year more and more fields are getting certified biochar? And eventually, how can we all collaborate to achieve that more and more certified biochar are on the fields? So Valeria, Paloma, what we need to do to ensure that biochar is actually a reality for everyone?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I had a problem with my earphones. So that's a great question, and I would frame practical steps differently for each group because they play different roles in the system. So I think that for farmers and end users, the key step is not to ask, does biochar work, but under what conditions does it make sense for my soil and system? And that means asking about feedstock, production conditions, application rates, and whether it has been tested in similar soils and climates. For researchers, from a research perspective, the most valuable contribution is already there, understanding variability. And a practical step is to keep that context visible when results are shared beyond papers, under which conditions effects were observed, and where uncertainty remains. And for certifier and standards body, a practical step is focusing on transparency and disclosure, not just whether a material meets a standard, but what information available to understand where it is appropriate to use. And for the industry in general, a key step is resisting overgeneralized claims. Products don't need to promise universal performance. They need to clearly intended use conditions and limitations. So across all groups, the practical step is the same: make assumptions explicit, and that's how we reduce failed applications, protect credibility, and support responsible adoption. And I just take the opportunity to invite everyone to IBI's website, in which you will find like a lot of different resources that you can use for your the different questions that I saw that you had in the chat. I'm so sorry that I did not answer to any of them, but I don't know why I could not do it, like my chat is closed or something. But if you can just go through our website, or just if you have any questions and want to contact us through our email, we are very glad and happy to help you in any way possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Valeria, because I think you touched the very important point is that you need to ask the right questions, and you can only ask the right questions if you have the knowledge to ask the right questions. And what we see from these sessions is that there's a lot of knowledge behind biochar and biochar applications. So thanks also for pointing that out. I also invite Simon and Paloma for your views. What are the next steps that we need to take to make biochar a reality for everyone.
I totally agree with Valeria, what she said. She took very specific points. I think it's necessary to get closer researcher, industry, and farmers, because sometimes when, like in my case, I'm a researcher and I read an article and that's all. It can't be like this. So doing things like this, I think we have many people watching what we are saying and getting involved. Today also in the morning we have another conference with farmers, like for meeting and specifying all the problems that farmer has, because we don't know sometimes what's the problem in the real field. So I think it's important to get involved, but all together.
Yes, so that's a good point also. But one of the things that farmers complain, and they mention quite often, is that the price of biochar makes it inhibiting them to give it a try, and then start that process of dialogue, because you've tried, you've experiment, you have feedback, you have points to raise. So the price is also something that comes up in the discussion. Simon, do you have the same perspective, feeling?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would agree with what Valeria and Paloma have said. Yeah, it's basically you need to make sure you've got the right biochar for the right situation. And I think the precautionary principle is sensible. If you apply the wrong biochar in the wrong place, you can drive negative effects, as we saw from the meta-analysis where we saw some negative yield effects. And once you apply biochar to soils, you can't take it out again. And I would challenge one of the comments from Behruz, who meant, which is in the chat, which said that basically if you follow the certifications, then your biochar can be considered reliable. I would argue that actually that certification is the minimum that we need. We do need it because we don't want people applying contaminated biochars to our agricultural soils. But there are aspects that we haven't even touched on, such as a priming effect, where when you apply biochar to soils, you can accelerate the turnover of soil organic matter. And if you continue that forwards into the future, you could end up with a situation where you have a soil which technically has more carbon in it because it's got biochar in it, but has less kind of active cycling carbon because you've burnt off the soil organic matter due to this priming effect. And without understanding the mechanisms, we can't really predict at the moment where if you take biochar A, if you put it in soils B, C, or D, where it might have a priming effect and where it wouldn't. And this is just one of the examples where some of the unknowns that we have really mean that we need to be cautious and make sure that we do understand biochar before we start applying this stuff very widely. And in terms of the costs, yeah, that's always going to be a tricky one. Until there are well-established carbon markets and other ways that biochar is being produced, costs are likely to be prohibitive moving forwards. Even in terms of the liming effect, you can buy lime to drive a liming effect for a fraction of the cost of biochar. So yeah, until carbon markets are more established, that incentive for farmers to be applying it isn't going to be there financially, I don't think, for some time.
Okay, so it's an industry that is still maturing, and hopefully we will see this in a near future because our soils need it. I need to come to call to a close this session. It was really a pleasure to have you here. I think we had wonderful discussions. You just opened the veil for what's the future sessions. So I will let you all to know that we still have another session on biochar coming on next week. So please join us if you are interested. There will all be new presenters from a different perspective. From my end, just to say it was really a pleasure to have you here, and we definitely hope that you can join us next week. And thank you, a special thanks to Paloma, to Valeria, and to Simon for your presence. Okay, nice to see you, and have a nice weekend. Bye.